Morning, everyone. Okay, I will do it again. Good evening and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 38th PANAAWTM Annual Conference. PANAAWTM stands for Pacific, Asian, and North American Asian Women in Theology and Ministry. Although this is our 38th annual conference, we were founded in 1984 through our co-founders, women of Asian heritage doing their doctoral work in ministry context. So I think how they came together is telling something about who we are. These young women studying theology and preparing for ministry almost 40 years ago decided to get together to support one another by expanding their network rather than competing with one another for same positions and jobs. So PANAAWTM has been working like that for the last almost 40 years by creating our network, by supporting one another, by promoting each other's scholarship, by expanding our work beyond our own circle so that we co-create the world we want to live in. Especially during global pandemic, many of us from Asian heritage living in Western societies have been experiencing personal attacks and hate crimes, and a lot of statistics also show that we have experienced a lot of trauma. Having gone through that experience, but not being noticed or recognized by our own communities, sometimes by white dominant society in general, this year annual conference decided to focus on healing and collective care and trauma. So I hope that this annual conference, especially through this opening panel, our great panelists will frame our discussion and theme that we will start another journey of healing for collective care so that we can co-create the world we want to live in. As I said, PANAAWTM was founded almost 40 years ago, and because of 2020, we postponed our annual conference that was all set to happen. We postponed that to next year. So this became 38th annual conference. However, next year in March, in Atlanta, where Columbia Theological Seminary is located, we will have a big celebration for our 40th anniversary. So I want you to mark that time in your calendar as you get the notice when everything scheduled is fixed, so that you can come to our 40th big anniversary and celebrate together. And also, I want you to know that the PANAAWTM has some grant funding available for students, and also some scholarship for our international participants, so that you can apply for those funding and travel and conference expenses. So please pay attention to our announcement. And if you have not joined our Facebook or Instagram or what we used to call Twitter, please join so that you are not left out from important news. And also, PANAAWTM relies on many people's generous donation of their time, their talents, and also gifts. So if beyond participating in our meetings and workshops and mentoring sessions, annual conferences, and other events that we do, if you want to support PANAAWTM by giving your time and also gifts, you can go to panaawtm.org and you will find there is a link for donation. So I know that you are here to hear from our amazing panelists. This panel will be moderated by what I call the best moderator I have ever seen and experienced, Dr. Grace Gao, who teaches at Claremont School of Theology, who is also on the board of PANAAWTM. Thank you, everyone, and welcome again. So Dr. Gao?
Thanks for that, Boyoung. That's kind of a hard thing to live up to, the best moderator in the business. I am delighted to be moderating this session tonight. We have 4 amazing speakers curated and selected by the program. committee. So my job is just to make sure that we keep on track, and I will facilitate conversation and call on people. We have decided to allow the speakers to introduce themselves. So I'll call on them one by one. You'll hear from Ann Jo, Gabes Torres, Angela Wong, and Myles Markham. And then I'm going to ask them a few leading questions. And again, I'll walk us through. But as they are muting themselves and unmuting themselves and speaking, I'm going to encourage the rest of you watching this Zoom, feel free to be active in the chat. You can send personal greetings to one another. You can, do your virtual amens or claps or heart emojis or whatever. So I absolutely encourage engagement in the chat. There is also a Q&A function. So after the period of prepared remarks and crosstalk, we will open it up to Q&A. And we would like you to first put your question in the Q&A, and then we will invite speakers to speak on that one-on-one. Boyoung, could you say something about translation, or did I miss that?
So yes, I was supposed to say that.
Okay.
So we made this new function available for our participants whose first language is English. So if you look at the bottom of the screen, there next to Q&A, you will find the CC in squares that says show captions. So if you click the show captions, you can turn on translation function. So when speakers speak in English, and then my caption language, you can choose whatever language that you are comfortable with. You can choose that translation caption so that while they're speaking in English, you can read what they say in your own choice of language.
Okay, fantastic. So without, if there aren't any further announcements, I'm now going to invite the speakers to introduce themselves as they see fit, one by one. So first we'll hear from Ann Jo.
Hello, everyone. So it's good to be here, and I want to thank all of you for being part of this conversation. And I'm hoping that it's more of a roundtable conversation here tonight. So my name is Ann Jo, and I teach Christian theology via a very interdisciplinary methodology that draws from Asian American studies, decolonial, post-colonial theories, feminist theories, and political theories. As some of you may know, my first book explored the theological interpretation of the cross through post-colonial feminist and psychoanalytic lenses. Part of the book examined dispossession, immigration, and the attending traumas of the Korean War through the film Joint Security Area and the documentary April 29th, which had, was a documentary of the Los Angeles situation after the Rodney King beatings. The police officers were acquitted. So it was my first attempt to articulate the expansive geographies of suffering through collective trauma and what is life-giving across time and space. And I'll say a little bit more about this, later. But so I'm interested in trauma studies and affect studies, and the way that historical violations compound part of this as forms of, our collective experience of traumas very differently across different contexts. I currently also serve as the director of our PhD program at Garrett, and I'm very glad to be here tonight.
Thank you, Ann, and we're so glad that you've joined us as well. So next we'll hear from Gabes Torres.
Hi, folks. My name is Gabes. My pronouns are she, they, and sha. Good morning from Manila. I am just in awe of my fellow panelists. Okay, I'm a psychotherapist, a trauma-informed psychotherapist. I focus a lot on racial and migration trauma, and also trauma from systems. I'm also a grassroots organizer, mainly in the Global South, and I'm also a journalist. And my history or my background around theology was that I was a historical theology major in undergrad, and then I completed 2 masters, one focused on post-colonial theology. I paid attention to the violation of hospitality within labor union groups and how that, ties to the church and all that. And I will say, though, that I'm a little, because I'm in the global South and haven't been in more theological spaces, which I know is not a problem. I haven't been in touch for a while, but ready to engage and happy to be here. Grateful to be here. That is all. That is I.
I love that, Gabes, and we are so happy to have you on this amazing panel as well. And next we'll hear from Angela Wong.
Hello, this is Wai-Ching, Angela Wong. You can call me Wai-Ching or Angela. I'm a Hong Konger born and raised in Hong Kong, and I received most of my education in Hong Kong except for my PhD, which I completed at the University of Chicago. Along with my 20-year-long teaching profession at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, I have actively participated in many world ecumenical organizations, including serving as the chair of the World Student Christian Federation, president of the Christian Conference of Asia, moderator of the Congress for Asian Theologians, and most recently, vice president of the United Board for Christian Higher Education in Asia. I was thankful for the invitation, but surprised to be asked, honestly, to speak on the topic, since I was not a trauma theologian or a counselor dealing with trauma. As far as I know, intergenerational trauma and collective healing have been a hated topic in many continents, especially for the indigenous peoples. May also happen like in some of the historical tragedies, such as wars. Two of them are actually unfolding every day right now in Ukraine and Gaza. In this regard, the closest I could think of a collective trauma experience was the events taking place from 2014 to 2019 and the aftermath in Hong Kong. Yet, it might be too close to call it an intergenerational trauma, although the events did involve people across generations. Given the political censorship at the moment, no systematic study could take place except for some independent films, news footage, and videos of testimonies that have been circulated outside of Hong Kong. If you want to hear more about that, ask me later. But another more closely related approach to my research would be the intergenerational discriminatory practices in women in general. I conducted several projects researching women's experiences from different religions, including Christianity, Buddhism, Taoism, and Islam in Hong Kong through oral history and in-depth interviews. If intergenerational trauma refers to trauma that is passed from a trauma survivor to their descendants, women living through adverse life conditions could pass their traumatic life experiences to their daughters and even daughters-in-law, or even their male offspring, whom I will leave aside for this discussion. So I can share more of the women's stories afterwards, and let's have a great conversation. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Wai-Ching. Thank you, Angela. Last but certainly not least, we have Myles Markham.
Hi, I'm Myles Markham. I use he, him, or they, them pronouns. I live in Los Angeles now, but I was raised, educated, and lived most of my life in the southern United States, Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. I am a part of both Native Hawaiian and Japanese American diasporas. I am transgender and I'm a non-binary person. Somebody who within traditional Kanaka Maoli culture would be described as mahu, which most closely translates to the word middle. And that was what's been used throughout millennia to talk about third gender people. I come to PANAAWTM as a community organizer, but also a former Christian educator. Most of my professional work has been in queer, transgender, racial, and reproductive justice, but I've also dabbled in movement work related to Indigenous rights and environmental care campaigns. religiously. I spent most of my life in conservative evangelical churches, internalizing theologies that supported and sanctified things like colonialism, misogyny, ethnocentrism, and spiritual violence. And so I've spent the last decade seeking what it means for the communities I'm a part of to heal from that on interpersonal, institutional, and structural levels. In seminary, I left an MDiv program at Columbia Theological Seminary and moved over to practical theology because that gave me the opportunity to design my own interdisciplinary degree and learn from many of the scholars who are here right now. And since graduating from that program in 2021, I've mostly left professional ministry, and I try to evade the call to public theology, but inevitably, as perhaps evidenced by my being here, right now, I can't seem to get away from it. I do, however, work primarily in the nonprofit sector, helping to run an organization called Trans Lifeline. We are the largest provider of direct services to transgender people in the United States, where we operate a peer support crisis line for transgender and non-binary people. And we give out money to trans and non-binary folks to cover legal fees, to supplement gender-affirming healthcare, and to provide commissary funds to trans folks who are incarcerated. That is it for me. I'm very happy to be here and excited to get into this conversation.
Thank you so much. So I hope those of you who were watching, your appetite has been whetted. We're in for what I hope to be will be, as Anne had mentioned, a robust conversation. So tonight's panel has been entitled Intergenerational Trauma, Collective Hatred, and Collective Care. And so we're going to move to a session where I'm going to be asking a leading question, and we're going to allow our panelists to give their reflections on that question. So here is question number 1. How can understanding the impacts of intergenerational trauma inform our approaches to fostering collective care? So that is the question. Anne, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Hey, so I sort of drafted something so I don't lose my train of thinking as I talk here. So let me just read this little thing that helped me sort of focus. So I was thinking that even more than 20 years ago, many folks, and particularly the Korean American community, spoke much about generational conflict among Korean Americans. Still, while there may be real issues here, much of the logic was one in which first generation was often portrayed as not modern, not American, not progressive, not this, not that, or not enough of all the things that were acquired and frequently pathologized, while the second generation aligned more with the respectability of being quote unquote American or quote unquote Americanized. There were things about my parents, for example, that I could not understand back then. But since then, I have a better understanding of ways in which their experience of trauma was embodied experience. So one example that has stayed with me since I was a child was we only made few trips on a airplane, a big trip. And during those times, my parents would pack our luggage as if we were going on some long, month-long journey where we were going to trek through some wilderness or something, and that the bag had to be like tightly, packed and locked and roped up and everything, right? And it used to sort of leave me bewildered, wondering where their anxiety was coming from. Or when we got to the other end of our trip, they would be at the luggage carousels, just frantically looking for their bag. And I'm thinking, it'll come when it comes, right? But they would just fret and sort of run around the area looking for their bag as if someone was going to take it or if it was going to get lost. And I've always wondered where that anxiety stemmed from. So their embodied anxiety was also something that they inherited, I think, from their parents, and then was also passed to me, and also a little bit about why I think this is the case. So let me say a few quick words here on intergenerational trauma and what now people call epigenetics. Epigenetic studies are alterations in the way that genes function. It potentially explains why the effects of trauma may endure long after the immediate threat is gone. And it is also implicated in the diverse pathways by which trauma is transmitted to future generations. Epigenetics explores particularly low-stress hormones like cortisol, indicating biological traces of parents and even grandparents' trauma. Transmission of trauma had been understood as parental behavioral impact previously on subsequent generations. Still, we know through numerous studies recently that epigenetics is about genetic expressions that become affected as early as even before you are born. Epigenetics is about adrenaline and cortisol levels and a whole slew of other chemistry in the body that have much to do with our fight, flight, or freeze reactions. Epigenetic changes can occur in a woman, for example, to her eggs while still young and appear in her children and their children, and especially noticeable in children with biological mothers who experience trauma. This helps us understand that transmission of trauma through generations is not just psychological, but epigenetics involve the body and entails how trauma becomes embodied. As such, it points toward more tendency in women, manifestations of health compromises like lowered immune systems, high blood pressure, a tendency toward diabetes or mental wellness issues. These genetic expressions can be responses to adapting for future trauma. So these changes need not be considered completely only negative. So I want to share a concrete example here. My paternal grandfather and grandmother, Jo Yun-hwan and Kim Se-hwa, were born in 1900. When they turned 10 years of age, Japan officially colonized and began their occupation of Korea. My father was born in 1940, and my mother was born in 1941 into this Japanese occupation. When they were 4 years old, Korea was liberated with Japanese occupation only to grow under US militarized imperialism, the Korean War, and into a divided Korea. As teens and young adults, they survived the devastating ruins of occupation and war. I was born in 1966 to the subsequent hardships of a nation in economic struggles, student movements and repressions, and US-sponsored military dictatorship. When I was 9 years old, we left for the US because for them at that time, Korea was unlivable, with slim possibilities for raising their children and guaranteed access to education. In the US, my siblings, my parents, and I endured the pains of US racism, Orientalism, classism, and various renditions of sexism. Historical and collective trauma is often compounded with even more ordinary expressions of violence and violation of the present. It was not until this past fall when I spent time visiting with my dad in Korea, returning to places of his young adulthood and hearing his memories that I realized the depth of what he and my mother relinquished when they made the journey to this country, and also what kind of terror they lived under while still in Korea, and what horrors they inherited from their parents. And it is no wonder they have anxiety about lost baggages. Indeed, as strangers in a strange land, it was only their longing, their memories of home that enlivened their immigrant life. For me, a decolonial trauma study then interrogates the neoliberal indebtedness to Western universalized codes for what is quote unquote wellness and quote unquote cure, and the imposition of diagnostic methods to other ways of being in the world, different practices of being in relation to all that is around us. In other words, when we speak of collective care in our communities, I hope we are mindful of not participating in what Gregory Cooler terms as the quote carceral system of care, end quote, that pathologize and leave our people only with despair and pain. Or as stated by Mimi Cook in her new book, Dear Elia, quote, but if we understand unwellness not as decontextualized individual pathology to be cured, but as a direct product of structural violence, if we are all differentially unwell in relation to the various structures of power and exploitation and degradation around us, then the question is not how to medically treat all these teens and young adults, or even how to expand access to treatment for them. The question becomes, what structures produce Asian American unwellness in this period of Asian American life? And how do we dismantle them, end quote. So I'm interested in decolonizing trauma studies because it might allow us a way to reconfigure what we mean by trauma and what we mean by collective care. Trauma, as you know, is quite the, I think Wai-Ching said, hot topic. It's, trauma this, trauma that, trauma-informed pedagogy, trauma-informed something. And in some ways, that's a danger in that such loose use of this word and concept can evacuate particular events in history or experiences, but also draw false equivalences across the board. But at least it might provide us with alternative ways than having to bleed all over the floor or to be the object of white spectacle, to have our pain and particular suffering be the only way to make demands on cultures and structures that produce violence and thus trauma. In recent years, there have been several powerful memoirs by Korean Americans. While I find them powerful, I also wonder who the audience is. Most often, these memoirs are overwhelmingly reactions to powers that be, and often overwhelmingly also only about our pain or what theorists name as negative affects. Specifically for me, the question of unmourned grief and loss or rage or shame has been preoccupying my studies lately, my research and writing, and leaves me with the question of, is it possible to attend to these affects while also reaching into archives that provide life-giving pathways so that we might practice and learn to be unwell together at times? So I'll just end it over here and might add a few more notes later on. But I think the main thing here for me is not that I have an answer to how do we care for, I have some suggestions later on, but that perhaps we need more conversations about what forms of trauma have we experienced and how are they even historically linked across time, space, geographical places as well. Because not only did we, particularly those of us who are here and have ancestry back in Asia as well, sometimes it was the white US imperial powers, but it was also each other across, right? That we've produced trauma for ourselves too. So I want to just leave it at that and turn it back to Grace.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anne. And absolutely, you've already surfaced a number of important concepts, and we will definitely allow you to have another opportunity to engage some of those suggestions. But now we'll turn to Gabes.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just letting all the wisdom and stories cascade through my body. And I'm remembering the time when I was introduced to intergenerational trauma, which really is the pathway to why I'm a therapist. When I was studying post-colonial theology, that's when I encountered epigenetics and the transmission of trauma on a cellular level. And I figured at that time, it would be nice if my therapist knew about this, or if my community knew about this, which is why from theology, I turned to psychology. But yeah, I think too, I feel led to say this these are hard topics. These are hard themes, intergenerational trauma, collective trauma. So I feel led to invite y'all to check in with body and with breath. Like I'm noticing myself dissociating earlier. And, part of collective care is to pay attention to the body, to pay attention to when we do need a deeper inhale and exhale. But because again, like these are not abstractions. These are like in our stories, in our bodies. So one of the things that has really benefited me in my work in terms of understanding intergenerational trauma is that it allows an expansion of imagination and an understanding of our collective identity. And it's not just in a horizontal level, like present time relationships, global realities, all connected, but also at a vertical capacity, ancestral, historical. And this highlights the fact that, no harm, no trauma is done in isolation. Neither does harm or trauma come from a vacuum. So this notion immediately challenges the hyper-individualistic impulse of the West, right? And I know that, this can be daunting because I've heard of several accounts that we have up to 14 generations of stored memory in our bodies. Some say 3. Even that is, that can be really overwhelming. That especially those of us who come from lineages of colonized ancestors, And with awareness comes choice, really. And that can be challenging too, because it takes a lot of work to not act on the trauma that we inherited, to not act on the shame that we inherited, to not act on the temper that we inherited, or the scarcity mentality that we inherited. It takes a lot of work, of emotional, robust work, and community support and self-compassion to heal. And it will feel like the cost will be high. But what I've come to know is that the cost of not working on our trauma will be higher. And we've seen this in the descendants of white European colonizers and settlers who've not taken into account the harm, the parasitic and violent choices that they've made, and their ancestors and that of their descendants. So what do we do with what we know? How do we take responsibility for our awareness of intergenerational trauma? And how do we take responsibility for the choices as a form of collective care? Like it can be, there's so much to it. They could do therapy. We can get back in touch with our bodies, since it is a colonial reality to be disembodied, reconnecting with our cultural heritage, be it food, dancing, whatever feels accessible, while also being mindful too that this can be hard because we're having to contend with the ways that we've been severed from our cultural heritage, whether that may be forced through epistemicide or because of the shame of our own family, our parents distancing us intentionally from cultural heritage. And, with the awareness of all of this, of all our choices, this can help us understand that we will one day be ancestors too. This can help prepare us to be ancestors one day. And I don't just mean like biological blood ancestors at all, since we can be mentors, we can be teachers, we can have spiritual descendants, And one of the things that I wish that conversations like this would highlight more is that we inherited also medicine and joy and love. We are more than our wounds, and our ancestors and generations before us have also passed down somatic wisdom on how to survive centuries of imperialism. I have inherited my ancestors' intuition, their animistic sensibilities, and the way that I'm so drawn to ecosystems. I inherited my Lola, my grandmother's love of justice. She was a guerrilla fighter against imperialism in World War II. And in terms of ancestral medicine, they might already be in our cabinets and our kitchens right now, like from the Vicks Vapor Rub to the ginger tea to the anti-inflammatory goods and foods that our parents and grandparents have been giving us. Even the lullabies that my mom sang to me that was passed down from my grandmother, and that I now sing to myself whenever I need to calm myself down. Like these are medicine. So in fostering collective care, what's the medicine, the passions, the stories that I inherited that can be instrumental in collective healing and liberation? How can I support my loved ones in doing the same? Because y'all, like, if there's anything that trauma studies taught me is that our bodies, they're a site for ancestral knowledge and wisdom. So what is it like to listen to our bodies, our stories that serve as a compass to ancestral memory and expansion? That's my take on that.
Thank you, Gabe. So a lot of nods I saw across the room and reactions. I love the attention to the body, the wisdom, all of that. Next, we're going to turn to Angela. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Angela.
Yeah. Okay, I'm really, really grateful for the two speakers before me because Anne has explained the theory so well, the concept so well, and then Gab has made the part of how to take care of our trauma also so well, so comprehensively. So maybe this is really good for me to good context for me to like pose a different angle for all of us to just think about, because I agree with what Anne said and also what Gabe has provided us to as a way out of the trauma. But in my interviews with the women in the different religions in Hong Kong, I did experience something different, and I want to share that with you for our conversation and reflection here. First, I mean, of course, I said women themselves, a lot of them, or most of them, are survivors of trauma in many ways. And I can remember immediately I met middle-aged woman who told me how she had grown up with a mother who had always cursed her since childhood and told her that she was good for nothing. And the effect was so deep on her that she was unable to confront her abusive husband after she got married. Instead, she had been trying hard to please him and win him back even after he cheated on her and verbally and psychologically abused her during the 20 years of marriage. She behaved just like the way she survived her abusive mother. So today she's already a professional counselor, but she's still struggling with that. Sorry? Okay, shall I continue? Okay, so this is a typical intergenerational trauma I think we can relate to. And it's passed from one generation to another, although I didn't know what happened to her mother, but surely her mother suffered also from the patriarchal culture and traditions that the Chinese community, all women still live with in many sense. But I think I also really drew on the concept of epigenetics, which is really crucial to the passing on of the intergeneration trauma. And the other angle I want to provide is the other women, a lot of these other women that I saw who bear with all this trauma, I mean, inflicted on them because of the patriarchal culture, and sometimes also came from religion, but they saw ways of living through it. These were stories I heard told by women living through physical abuse, isolation, and desertion, those raising 7 to 8 children single-handedly with very few resources. And there were stories of grave grievances. But amazingly, however, many of these stories testify something like rather than passing on a kind of survival genetic of passing on the trauma, they passed on a kind of survival genetic of enduring the sufferings, staying quiet, and keeping the traumatic effects at bay. I met a woman who was badly physically abused as a child, but hid her painful story to herself because she believed that as a Christian, she must forgive and then maintain a harmonious family was her primary role. And it's all contradict to our understanding of how our autonomous woman should live. But she was very successful in living a life with no sign of traumatic effects. What I'm trying to put forward is this go against our understanding of counseling principles or the well-being in the modern day. But from what I heard from her, such a submissive outlook actually masks some immense strength in exercising an ingrained sense of agency. So rather than swarm themselves in unending pain left by their traumatic experiences, these women activated a deeply embedded power to take control of their lives in the ways that were possible for them, because they couldn't change the larger environment, but they did use this, I would call also epigenetics of women suffering. They're suffering quietly, but they also use this ingrained agency to exercise change, even though they could not change their larger environment at all immediately. So the submissive self is not as vulnerable as it is usually understood. So what I'm trying to point to is this ingrained agency that is also part of the epigenetics. Okay, I think I would like to hear others' response as well.
Yeah, so thank you, Angela. So I hope you're all seeing that there are some connections already from the 3 speakers we've heard from, and definitely some challenges to received wisdom. And we're going to hear now from Myles to add to our discussion. Myles.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think for me, understanding the impact of intergenerational trauma inform my community's different approaches to fostering collective care in a couple ways. First, being really familiar with the oppressive histories of our relatives and ancestors. And I want to say that is not just biologically speaking. I think queer and trans people in particular share an ancestry with each other in a way that may not be transmitted, through our DNA and epigenetically, but I think psychosocially has been inherited. So I just wanted to add that extra note there. But these oppressive histories of our relatives and ancestors gives us insight into core fears and prejudices and discriminatory attitudes that we might be harboring toward ourselves and toward each other. And I think are a tremendous barrier in any community's pursuit of justice and liberation. Like many of my co-panelists have articulated in different ways, acceptability and respectability within dominant culture for survival are concepts that have been a part of my own family, both immediate and extended. But the insights about these, how and why it happened the way that it did, have made it possible to identify what the wounds are and to trace the way that those are materializing in present form, which is critical, I think, in creating the kinds of messages and counter narrative and practices of nurturance our communities need to hear, so that we don't continuously trigger or perpetuate those historical harms. I think one big revelation for me over the years was that rather than simply fighting or disparaging the ways that my ancestors and my family had tried to fit in, I could look at that as a tool, a set of social technologies that they created to survive. And related to this, I think a second part of understanding intergenerational trauma tends to focus around pathologies, stress disorders, the ways that we get triggered, activated, or dysregulated when our body, remembers something that our ancestors have experienced. But in terms of forming collective care, I think it's really important to spend just as much time focusing on post-traumatic growth. In addition to ancestral medicines and foods and some of these other techniques that have been described here, I think it's worthwhile to explore for our ancestors and for our family members, what, in their own words, did they describe as making their lives rich and meaningful? What gave them hope and joy? What made them want future generations to come into this world? One thing I frequently hear millennials and Gen Z folks articulate when it comes to having children is that they don't want to bring kids into this world. There's a kind of collective despair that exists. And so I want to know from my ancestors, why did they not feel that? No matter how oppressive or destructive their reality was, why did they choose to hope for us and what could be possible for our lives? So that's something that I'm paying a lot of attention to is what were the tools, what were the strategies that were physical, emotional, and spiritual that we can take ourselves and adapt and innovate on. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Myles. So again, I love the way you've added by complexifying our discussion and showing cases where your perspective is slightly different, and of course, calling us back to really pressing questions about ancestral wisdom, given the rise of antinatalism. And I definitely feel that as well. So what we're going to do now is move toward a final round where I'm going to ask our panelists one final question. But as a reminder, I encourage you all to participate in the chat And also, if you have a question that you would like to ask either the entire panel or to a particular panelist, please utilize the Q&A function. So again, I'll ask one question, I'll have the panelists respond to that one question, and then we'll move to a free-flowing conversation / Q&A. So here is that final question. And some of the panelists have already started to engage it, but now we're going to ask it more directly. And that is, given the first question about understanding the pain and the trauma, that type of thing. Now, this question is, what strategies can we employ to address that collective trauma and hatred within and across our communities? So once again, we'll go in the same order, and let's hear first from you, Anne.
Okay, thank you. I feel like hearing, the others in the round table here, we're really all, this requires so much multi-pronged approach, right? So there's no one singular way of approaching this question of intergenerational trauma, I think, and we're just only starting to scratch the surface. So I think for me, it's critical for the sake of our children, as well as our ancestors, that we delve into whatever archives of our ancestors and our present community to find forms, practices of remembrance, lamentation, practices of requiem for the past losses, for the present losses we do not know how to grieve yet, and for the future losses we feel keenly and yet may not have precise words to name. These include losses like the disappearance of even acid-free rain, clean air, toxic-less soil, minor or ordinary daily slights, microaggressions to state-sanctioned oppressive policies. I want to briefly mention Patricia Kahn-Kuhler, who is one of the founders of the Black Lives Movement. She wrote a memoir, When They Call You a Terrorist. And it's a memoir about an upbringing plagued by interlocking oppressions and generational trauma. She offered practices and ways of loving during her lifetime, with multiple family relations that involve incarceration, addictions, presence and absence in her life in the midst of and at the whims of white supremacist structure in the US. This memoir was profoundly moving for me because of the presence of fierce love and a way of being in the world with all these quote unquote problematic relations that through unexceptional, ordinary ways of acceptance and love defied white supremacist structures. Her family and their extended family lived in forms of care that were counterintuitive to the dominant US liberal culture of care, which often pathologizes further racial stereotypes built on specific notions of class, economics, education, ableism, you name it. What I read in the memoir was a testament to ordinary decolonial practices of love and acceptance that in truth was powerful political refusal to abandon members of her community deemed unworthy. Of course, neither she nor the reader is left with naive romanticism, but her lived experience galvanized her to form a political movement known as Black Lives Matter with others, a movement born out of refusal and also a deep love for her people and how things can be otherwise. For me, de-universalizing care or wellness is the work of decolonization and is political. And as such, we must ask questions of what being unwell means. Who determines what being unwell is? Who determines what is a good and proper way of being well? What happens when we travel into our supposed unwellness and are accompanied by those in our communities in our unwellness? We may find that our collective care is not when we walk away, dismiss, discount, ignore, or pathologize our traumas. Perhaps it is in the journey of looking to the past and beyond us to the larger context and entangled histories and structures to ask how these traumas were made possible. How is it that trauma continues to reproduce itself? How is it that new forms of trauma, from the ordinary to the extraordinary, continue to compound already received traumas? Have we sat with our traumas? Are traumas expected to have productive outcomes? And what if our traumas are completely unproductive in a productivity-driven world? Is the goal of our collective forms of care toward a collective universalized cure? We know life isn't a Hollywood film of neither happiness nor certainty, nor only about horror, never-ending despair and sorrow. Life I think, is laden with moments of each and a mix of both. And there are moments of communion with the self, the world, and the mystery of the divine that thread, even if slim, through moments in our lives with one another. I hope that as our communities begin to name those structures that produce traumas, and as we start to name multiplicity of traumas compounded by more traumas, research or collectively create resources from other archives bequeathed to us from our ancestors, allowing us a more capacious understanding of what it also means to sit with one another and to sit with both sweetness and bitterness in life, as well as critically name work toward the abolition of systems and structures created to undo us persistently. We must reach into different archives and learn rituals and practices for our world making, otherwise, perhaps counterintuitively.
Thank you so much, Anne. And again, feel free to share your appreciation or comments in the chat, and we are taking questions as they roll in. Next, we'll hear from Gabes to the question I asked, and I also put it in the chat in case you have forgotten it. Go ahead, Gabes.
Thank you. As a therapist, I started giggling when Anne mentioned, is trauma work productive? I just started, yeah. Oof, it is not. And from a capitalist perspective, and in a way it doesn't have to be. So, and it's also quite messy. So I just want to highlight too that this is not a linear process of healing, you know, the ways that we try to come up or co-create the strategies in healing collective trauma in our across communities. But first, I want to address kind of like a more pragmatic note. One of the things that I was led to say in answering this question is reparations, especially to those on Turtle Island. I know that for those of us who come from immigrant families and who are migrants, I was a migrant there, I was an international student there, so I had to contend with a very inhumane, hateful immigration system. And so it really questioned and threatened my sense of belonging. And I think that we can complexify that reality too by knowing what it's like to repair our relationship with the land. Like for instance, when I was in so-called Seattle, occupied Duwamish territory, there's this grassroots organization that gave us the opportunity to pay real rent to the Duwamish tribe every month. So that can be a commitment that you can consider on a practical level. Like, what is it like to employ this strategy in healing collective trauma? Because we got to understand that healing collective trauma also includes healing our relationship with the land. And this means contending with the reality that, you know, many of us are on stolen, exploited land. So that's one bit that I want to address as a practical strategy. The other thing that really helped me in confronting collective trauma and hatred is story work. And I'm super biased because I'm a lot of my initial trainings in psychology was narrative-based trauma therapy, and I tried to also complexify that in the context of politics and social identities. So it's a matter of asking, you know, what were the stories that I bought into that developed and festered the trauma and the hatred? What are the harmful structures and ideas of dogma? What are the social codes that threaten my sense of belonging? And to try to be as self-compassionate as possible in the process, as there is a tendency to over-pathologize trauma, when trauma is more like it's not so much the event of the injury as it is like the after effect. So it's the ongoing response to trauma. I really loved what Myles said earlier about framing the traumatic response as you didn't say this exactly, I apologize, but like a social technology, a tool. And how do we transmute that would be instrumental in collective care while avoiding over-pathologizing the survival mechanisms, the coping strategies, because again, colonialism and systems of oppression, we do need some degree of dissociation, even assimilation, and just really sitting with the complexities around these stories. And I want to highlight too the importance of, while we unlearn and deconstruct, I think it's also important to reconstruct. I wish this was highlighted in psychology school. There was so much unlearning to do and deconstruction to do, which is important. But I feel it's more responsible to reconstruct and to step a little bit further to remember I like the term remember, like re-member, because we've been dismembered. We've been fragmented from our cultural heritage, even from our motherland, our language, even our relationship with our families. And I'm so mindful of if there are any adoptees here, I can understand like the complexities around that level of separation and severance. And even though remembering is going to be imperfect, it's up to us to decide now, what do we say no to? What are the imperialist social codes and hierarchies that I say no to? And it's asking the question, what do I say yes to now? You know, and this can be really vulnerable, but it can also be really beautiful. I suggest reading up on Audre Lorde's uses of the erotic. I think that it's possible to resist these imperialist social codes, hierarchies, and structures of oppression, while also inviting in desire and pleasure and embodiment and community and even spirit in the process, however way that would look like for you. So that's my take on that.
Thank you, Gabe, so much for that. The very practical suggestions and then talking about the importance of remembering. We now turn to Angela. I also want to let you know that I'm getting some questions through the Q&A function as moderated by my fabulous team, so keep those coming as well. Angela.
Hello, thank you. And again, very happily preceded by two speakers who help what I'm going to say. And there are a lot of things that we need to do, I mean, collectively, including policy advocacy, especially for women or the minorities groups or people who suffered continuously from the system. And in my case, I just want to use the experience I had with the women that I interview. I did primarily oral history and interviewing, hearing life stories. Yeah, Gab also mentioned about narrative therapy. I am not doing therapy, but I do a lot of, I provide a lot of time and space for life stories, sharing of life stories. And each interviewee was given time. Some of them for the first time. Some of the elderly women that interviewed, they said, this is the first time I was interviewed. Why interview me? Why about my life? What is that in my life that need to be heard? So given the time and space to tell the story the way they liked and be the focus and be attentively listened to and recorded, written up, and eventually got published. Some people said that collective healing can come through like intentionally created healing spaces. I feel that by accident, I did not plan it out that way, but it happened in a way that it really became like creative healing spaces. I remember when we do the book launch for the publication of the oral history, I gathered all the women interviewees again, and then we celebrate together. Of course, it's a celebration of the book. It's a celebration of their life. And at the time we did that, there was one moment, all the women, many of them like 60, 70 years old, and they line up and signing for the book of one another. And then they show me the page of the book with all the women's names on the second to the cover page. And that was a stunning experience for me, because without realizing it before, that they are actually celebrating their life and also celebrating their memory and celebrating that for once that they were the center of their life. And so it became like a festive ritual of celebration. And I think this kind of space for sharing, peer support, mutual care, or just a joyous gathering together could be a very important point of a celebration for their life. And these women also rely on religion. I know, I mean, a lot of us who having been critical, will be critical towards our religious traditions also. And when I heard stories from the different religions, women from different religions, I also have a lot of questions in my mind. But these religious women did rely on religion as a way to reframe their life. We talk about reframing their life. I mean, they reframe their life to see the difficulties in their life as something that is that has a reason, for whatever reason. And then they also use that as a point of turning towards more positive way of looking and moving forward. So I think that's also wonderful. If again, I mean, I have so many stories to tell, but I don't think I have the time to explain everything, but that's what I want to share here.
Thank you, Angela, so much. And Myles, once again, last but not least.
Sure. I guess mine are not strategies per se, but we could call them tools. And the first, it's already been referenced a little bit, but I would name as peer support. Something we've discovered at Trans Lifeline, and I think applies broadly to people in marginalized communities, especially those facing acute mental health crisis or crises, is that while there might be dozens of reasons safety and security have become compromised for a person, poverty, houselessness, unemployment, harassment, and so forth, the greatest driver to our hotline, the greatest driver of despair, is actually one singular thing, and that is the feeling of isolation and the tremendous weight of loneliness and believing that even if surrounded by people, you are utterly alone in what you're going through. So I think healing collective trauma has to start with building concrete ways to find each other, to see each other, to be seen by each other, and to feel known. And I think if at all possible, a lot of studies around isolation and loneliness have corroborated this idea that what helps to fight against that is being in person together, having the physicality of each other, our breath, our tears, our laughter, our life, having affinity spaces with our peers cannot be understated in healing work. And then my second tool, just mentioned here by Dr. Wong, is about the importance of creating and pursuing collective delight. I think it might be simplistic to say healing is a process, but it is, and it's a process that is usually very difficult and slow.
Hold on, Myles. We just lost you in audio.
Oh,
Oh, yep.
Can you hear me now? It
Yep.
was the AirPods. I will just go healing process. Healing is a process. It's slow, it's nuanced, it's difficult. And to me, for it to happen sustainably, to do things like facing our histories, to do things like pursuing restorative justice with each other, to repair and to build something new, we have to create practices, rituals, routines that create a sense of shared joy, delight, pleasure. We have to have time to have recreation together, to play together, to make sure that pursuing justice and healing is serious when it needs to be serious, but is also something that produces joy and is fun. And I think that gets overlooked, but it is a discipline and it is a practice to prioritize delight. And I think that's really key in thinking about collective healing.
Thank you so much, Myles. So at this point, I'm mindful of the fact that the audience has been very patiently waiting to engage even more directly, but our panelists have given us their wisdom. They've prepared thoughtful remarks. So I invite folks to put your little heart emojis, your little clap emojis, your good thoughts in the chat to thank our panelists for the preparation that they've done. So go ahead and do that. Oops, sorry, sorry, I didn't realize that I hid myself. And then at this point, I'm going to call on some folks who have thoughtfully put in questions in the Q&A to ask. So when you hear your name, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. So the first question we have is from Amy Bush. Amy, if I can find you, I'm scanning the faces. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi. Thank you guys so much. My question is, how do you see and how do you feel like modern media and creative and artistic expression has facilitated a space for more vulnerability around trauma and collective care?
So I believe that question is to any and all of the panelists. So panelists, you don't need to wait for me to call on you. If you would like to respond, just go ahead and unmute yourself and engage the question.
I can go. Thank you for the question. So beautiful. The first thing that came into mind were a lot of the grassroots organizing that's happening here. So often here in Manila or in the Philippines, so often the artists are at the forefront of this type of work. There can't be a revolution without the artists. And I think it also has to do with the political landscape too. A lot of what the Philippines is contending with is erasure of our history of fascism and colonialism. And so that it's ingrained in the education system. So what the artists are doing in the most vibrant and brave and accessible ways have been telling the truth about, hey, we can't forget about this part about our history. And the state, like a part of state violence, is erasing this part of our history. And so the artists have been producing, circulating, self-publishing zines, for example. These are like short for magazines. That's one example. There have been a lot of like poetry and storytelling spaces around here. I think that even the food scene, I know that food can be I think that it's a portal and a creative site as well. There's been storytelling even in food. Like I think about the Kamayan tradition, a ritual that we have where we use Kamayan means hand or by hand. And we all share, there's no separate plating. We all share from one big feast, like as a way to preserve who we are in such a creative way. So yeah, and I think too, like even movies these days, movies have been doing a great job in unveiling our collective identity and have been bravely, in their own way, telling some truth about our colonial reality and where we could be, through story in the form of film and in the form, there's just so much. It's a beautiful question. And I think too that Global South stories are worth amplifying when it comes to this question.
Thank you. Any other panelists?
Myles.
Okay.
I think, similar to what Gabes mentioned, and I think Myles and, Angela as well. I think for me, part of the trauma, intergenerational trauma or one's own trauma, compounding it is so much part of the body experience. So I find that, joy or delight is very bodily, right? Or practices that are bodily are very healing. And it's interesting because, there's this sort of very dichotomous experience as a Korean American growing up. They're very I have found that, my parents' generation were very disembodied in some ways, and on the other hand, overly embodied, right? So there's sort of strange combination at work, but learning to reach into myself, reach into friendships, to cultivate moments of joy, practices of learning how to make food. For me, it's a practice of learning how to make kimchi, fermenting kimchi, trying to learn that. And one of our PANAAWTM members suggested I maybe pick up knitting. So, knitting helps me kinetically to work, through bodily affects, if you will. I wonder if in the church, the religious dimension is really such a site that could be so exclusive and damaging and harmful. At the same time, I wonder if there's a way in which, new forms of ministries, new theologies that really reach back prior to, colonial projections of what kind of Christians we ought to be. If there are ways in which these sacred gatherings can also provide spaces in which we come together, right? In which relationships are cultivated, our kinships are cultivated, being vulnerable with one another is cultivated, and also empowering one another. So for me, more and more, I was a person who walked away from a church a long time ago. I find church religious spaces to be a very interesting place now, depending on who is part of that community, right? And there's so many ways in which communities are formed. I think the second is that arts, they have always been, as Gabe said, at the forefront. In some ways, the humanities sometimes lags behind, but music, literature, poetry, storytelling, they have been sort of the vanguards leading us, right, and reaching into the affective dimensions of our own pain or joy or what have you. And I'm hopeful that artists who somehow more easily maybe cross boundaries show us how to practice sort of this transnational solidarities, internationalist solidarities as well, right? So that, particularly for speaking for myself located in the US, it tends to be very myopic, right? So.
Let's hear from Myles. Thank you, Anne.
Yeah, something I think about like the intersection of media. We're talking about magazines, we're talking about social media, we're talking about films, TV, music, and how that's opened up a conversation within our different communities, allowed us to be vulnerable. I call it like a cultural like midrash. When any of these projects are produced and we're seeing them, whether it's on a Netflix sort of streaming service or it's in theaters or where people are talking about a particular book and we have so many folks in the community commenting on it, I think it creates a culture where we're allowed to speak out and share our opinions. And I think that for a long time that had in many of our lineages that's sort of perceived as a hyper individualistic or like a Western sort of way of being with each other to assert your opinion on something. But I think that that is changing. I think that that's something that's really opened up for folks is this empowerment or feeling of being emboldened to offer your opinion, to talk about how a TV show or a film made you feel and what you believe that representation to be like. I think arts really evoke that in a very particular kind of way. I liked the nod to the Audre Lorde text, uses of the erotic, because she explores that, like the sensuality, that we hold in not just a physical form, but a spiritual form. And I think media and arts in particular give us, it's a portal, it's an access point, it's a conversation starter. And that's something I really appreciate. And I've worked in documentary film for a few years too. And a friend once asked me, like, how do I tolerate the criticism? Because I've worked on projects that a lot of people hate. And I said that for me, the way like I think about creativity and the way I think about artistry is that nothing is ever like too precious to be like above or beyond reproach or critique. And so something in that reproach, something in that critique, I think people from the outside can see that as like intra-community fighting, but I actually think there's a way we're being vulnerable with each other and being able to share what resonated with us and what was dissonant, you know, for us in on a piece of work.
Can I just add a short comment? It's so wonderful to hear from Myles and also Gabes, who have actually been practitioners of arts and media. And I just want to add one short comment about the situation of Hong Kong. Suddenly, everybody pay attention to local produced films and songs just because that they are made in Hong Kong. I mean, it's like I grew up in the colonial time, but I had never experienced a suppressive culture as much as now. And that Hong Kong made culture through arts and media actually become, for me and for a lot of my friends, like collective therapy, if you understand. I don't have time to go into all the details describing that, but just this label of made in Hong Kong art and films have provided so much. So yeah, this is collective healing.
Yeah, thanks for that. So Amy, thanks for getting the Q&A started. You know, you've had all 4 panelists weigh in. I'm going to call in this order Sonia Lee, Sungran Kim, and Sukya Peng. And that might be time depending on how long our panelists take. And then we will close with announcements. So those 3 people in that order, beginning first with Sonia.
Thanks, Grace. So thank you to the panelists for your talks. Guess I wanted to ask a question to Angela. You mentioned something about ingrained agency. And I was really surprised and intrigued to hear that, because the stories that you told us about, which I really appreciate, were really sad. And as a person who is very much embedded within the kind of model minority community where there's been so much pressure for us to perform wellness, I was thinking that with Angel's comment about how we are all unwell in different levels, I felt like part of the reason why we haven't talked about trauma in our Asian and Asian American communities is that we've performed being well so well, right? And so I guess I'm just going to be honest and tell you that I'm a little skeptical about what kind of agency that you saw and how we may validate those or not. And then I was just thinking about Myles' comment about how young people these days may refuse to have children. And I feel like part of that is that young people these days know too much. They've seen too much, right? Whereas and again, this might be like my second generation bias, but I feel like part of the reason why older women chose to have so many kids is that it's just like, you know, willful blindness, a choice not to see, you know. So I don't know. I'm curious about what you saw in your oral histories, Angela.
Well, I can give a 3-hour lecture on this topic, but I'll just give one example. A Buddhist woman I met, and her life was miserable before she became a Buddhist, and her marriage ruined. Her husband cheated on her. Very poor economic situation. Then one Buddhist master read her palm and told her that all of this was because of her former life. Now she has to pay the debts of her former life. A story that I mean, intellectually could not fully understand, but this point turned her life around. And not only that she became a Buddhist, she actually worked herself so well that she became a master herself and leading like thousands of followers in the end. So what I'm seeing is, although her situation had not changed, her family was still a lot of crap, and then her life had been improving gradually, but not like entirely changed. The patriarchal culture, that's what I meant. I mean, the structure itself has not changed. And Buddhist religion has its own patriarchal structure as well. But the life of this woman changed because of her will to change, I would say. And that's the ingrained agency that I saw in not only her, but many other women interviewees. So I feel that, yes, the trauma is heavy, intergenerational, and the larger environment cannot be changed easily. But the person who decided to change it, somehow with the religious inspiration, change it for herself at least and her family. So that's what I saw is important not to miss, especially when I interview the women.
Thank you, Angela. If you have that 3-hour lecture, we will put it on PANAAWTM's website so we can learn more from you. But at this point, we're going to turn to Seung-Ran Kim's question, and deep apologies if I'm butchering people's name. So Seung-Ran Kim, this is your opportunity to ask your question.
Okay, thank you, Grace. I would like to ask just one question to our panelists. Many times when I participate in collective healing processes, I often experience vicarious traumas, which are very, very hard for me to cope with. How could we encounter and embrace these vicarious traumas in the process of collective healing? Sometimes I do not want to share my trauma with our loved ones because I do not want to hurt them. So this is my question. I would love to respond. I just spoke with somebody who went to this somatic experiencing training, and they made the bold claim of saying that everything is vicarious trauma. And it's also not if, but when we are exposed to other people's trauma, especially with the higher exposure that we have on screens, especially with the state of the world right now. So I just want to emphasize it's not if, but when, you know, and I so hold the care that you have in trying to like keep people from witnessing your trauma. But I think that it's time to be bold too, to share it. You know, I think it would not heal if we were trying to heal in isolation. So just to encourage the invitation to vulnerability around that. And maybe I'll share this later, but I co-created, conceptualized a framework called Oscillation. So I built this framework with some of the mentees and grassroots organizers and human rights defenders that I've been working with. And a lot of them, it's again, like their exposure to trauma and to violence is pretty high. And yet they still continue to commit to frontline on the ground work. It's still necessary. Like I can't, you know, as a therapist, I can't tell them to not do it, which oftentimes actually psychologists and therapists do discourage human rights defenders to stop. But the process of oscillation is, so there are 4 components to it. I won't get into it too much, but there's rest, digest, and process, and then resist. So the idea is that we are mindful of our limitations, of our bodies, and its high capacity to store trauma and to externalize other people's trauma. Y'all can, on Oscillation, you can go to my website and or Instagram account, but it's this free guidebook that y'all can also share to your community members. But basically the idea is that we continue to move or titrate between states to, yes, we do need to rest, but we do need to return to resisting. And we try to be as trauma informed as possible and to be mindful of the nervous system. And I can send the link here on the chat box. But that's a direction for you.
Any other responses? If not, we'll move to our final 2 questions.
Can I just
Anne,
offer
go ahead.
a quick response, Grace?
Mhm.
So we have a practitioner here, so I am one of those people that she may be practicing upon. But I think, you know, having a good therapist, I think, you know, in some of our communities, going into therapy is sort of equated with there's some level of shame about this, like there's something wrong with you again, right? So, but I have found if you could find a good therapist, I think it's always very helpful because it helps to sort of understand why it could become another vicarious trauma, right? And also, at least for me, it's helped where that sort of reaching into myself, it doesn't happen, but it doesn't take away from my empathy either. So, you know, that was just like a sort of a offer out there, I guess, just from my own personal experience. So I suggest everyone going to therapy. Okay, it's good for us.
Yay, therapy. Thank you, Anne. So in the interest of time, I'm going to invite Sukia Ping and Isabella Novsima. Again, apologies if I'm butchering your names, to ask your questions one at a time. And then I'm going to open it up to the panelists to address what of the 2 questions, if any, you'd like to say. And then we're going to end with Ai-Hyung, who's going to give some closing announcements. Okay, so Sukia Ping, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Grace, and thank you all to, our panelists for the very inspiring conversations. As I ponder on our theme today, I couldn't help thinking, while the notion of intergenerational trauma gives us the language to acknowledge the complicated wounds we experience collectively, I wonder to what extent such a notion and the way how it conditions our vision of collective care may also inadvertently leave us skewed towards the ideology of feminism or family ideology, which has been and continues to exacerbate trauma experiences on many levels. I'm asking that because I also have in mind how the family metaphor is often deployed in describing communities where we expect to be healing, like the church or our chosen families. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And Isabella, your question. Okay, let me quickly scroll to it if I can find it. Oh, here we go. How do you define a collective when the illusion of separation is constructed within the community itself? For example, in the community of people with disabilities, there is a tendency to differentiate between people who are not disabled enough, for these invisible disabilities, which some are caused by trauma, and those who are utterly disabled, which usually refers to people with visible disabilities. I think this illusion of separation might happen within other communities. If so, how can we define a collective? Thank you so much for these amazing panelists. So panelists, between those 2 questions, any responses?
For me, community, if you're seeking a community for healing, you go to those who can listen to you and understand you. Unless you want to dialogue with a bigger community for mutual understanding on a different level. But otherwise, like friendly circles for me can be a good place for collective healing as well.
I think I don't know if it was Suki's question, but the question of intergenerational and the problematics of the familial. For me, I use that idea of intergenerational trauma very loosely. So it's not necessarily like immediate family intergenerational itself. So that's very broad for me in terms of the sociality and the relationality of what is in the intimate sphere of my life. So it could be very broad. And I don't really have the answer to Brianna's question, but it's interesting, like the sort of the racialization process also is laced with the logic of disabilities, right? And ableism as well. So they're really enmeshed in sort of constructing each other's logic, I think. So that's something to really examine even more deeply, I think. And I'm sorry, I don't have a response to that. It's something that I still try to work through myself, So I don't know, maybe Gabes or Myles.
Quick response, Myles?
Sure. I was gonna speak to Isabella's questions about the definition of the collective. I've worked in a lot of collectives that represent people across identities, and what I hear you speaking to is like the bifurcation that like happens within movements, and I think in a objective way comes from the reality that even if people share an experience, like you mentioned, of being disabled, the way that materializes, not just because of what that particular disability is, but because of what race that person might have, what gender that person might have, the kind of intersectional concerns there informs then what it's like to be disabled for that particular person. And what I think people are sort of getting at is there are still ways power, privilege, and oppression can happen inside a shared like affinity. And so to me, it's not that that's no longer a collective, but that just has to be something that like the collective has to acknowledge explicitly and directly and be really clear about that. Even if in this particular case, we're all people who are fighting for like disability rights and justice, that's going to look different across our experiences. And so that's not to create the phrase I think many people might be familiar with is like oppression Olympics, who, quote unquote, has it worse, but to really deal with or to apply a lens of like power, privilege, and oppression to any like shared group you're ever a part of, and trying to create, a just end, for.
So thank you so much. So as you can see, we were just getting started with rich conversation, Q&A, and fortunately, this is just night one of a multi-day conference, and a number of these panelists will be attending the rest of the conference, and we hope you can continue to have conversation and dialogue in those days. I'm going to turn it now. Oh, so before I do, please join me in thanking these esteemed panelists for their wisdom and sharing their thoughts and responses with the group. Okay, Ai-Hyung, it's all you.
Okay, thank you. Wow, what a remarkable plenary session we just shared. Your insight have truly illuminated our discussion today. So let's offer our applause and virtual icon of gratitude to our distinguished moderator, Dr. Grace Kao, as well as the entire team behind the PANAAWTM Annual Conference. Yeah, their dedication and hard work has been the cornerstone of this amazing panel. Also, I'm filled with gratitude for each contributors with your question and participant here. So your engagement and insight have gently enriched our collective journey. Okay, so I am Ai-Hyung Lee, the chair of the PANAAWTM Annual Conference Committee, and it is my privilege to guide us through this transformative experience. So as we look forward to another day filled with potentials, hope, and stories, I'm excited to invite you to continue this journey of connection and dialogue. So let's dive into just few critical details to maximize our engagement in tomorrow's program. Did today's discussion blow your mind? Good news, today's public panel was recorded. So, yes, you heard it right. You will be able to revisit all those powerful moments and insight at your own pace, right?